Everybody, this is the Baker Institute Energy Forum. You're all sort of regulars, so I guess probably don't have to do the usual, we have the Energy Forum, members from our membership from our many local energy companies and some of the banks and so forth. And tonight we have a very special and interesting program. A lot of us that look at the U.S. market, we look at the U.S. market and we don't worry about what's happening in the specifications in Asia or China or other places and think about how that's going to affect what imports are available to come to the U.S. We just sort of go on the blithe assumption that all the gasoline we need is just going to arrive here in the U.S. and we can just keep driving around. But Al Troner is here to give us some words of warning tonight on the picture, international picture for fuels and changing specifications and how that's going to relate to the U.S. market. Al Troner is president of Asia Pacific Energy Consulting, which is a Houston-based tactical consulting company focused on commercial oil and natural gas issues for the Asia Pacific and Middle East Gulf. Al is one of our frequent contributors to our many academic studies on Asia Pacific and Middle East issues. He was a participant in our geopolitics of gas study. He has took care of together with one of our Rice professors, this case study on Troner for the NOC study. And he's a co-recipient with me of the 1994 prize from the International Association for Energy Economics and a longtime colleague from when we were both at PIW. So, Al, we look forward to hearing your presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Amy. Am I on this or this? Okay. I was thinking when I took this topic, calling this How the Other Three Quarters Lives, because there's always a natural tendency of people to think of where they are as the whole world, okay? I come through the looking glass like Alice. Our point of view is the other side. And I wanted to give one caveat here is that we're in a very uncertain situation right now with demand in general in the West and particularly for transport fuels. So take these forecasts as indicative rather than actual, though they're as actual as I could have made them last week. Okay, I'd like to try to focus here on product quality and all of the other things that are entailed within that. Some quick definitions we used for the Western data: IEA, the EIA section of U.S. Department of Energy, and the BP Statistical Handbook. Everything Asia Pacific and the Middle East Gulf is ours, which we've been following. I lived in Asia over 20 years, and I've been working in Asia Pacific and the Middle East for 25. So we have data running back for quite some time. Now, the first thing I'd like to disabuse you of is that not all gas oil is diesel. Okay, but all diesel is gas oil. Okay, and we use these as synonymous in the West. The rest of the world does not. Okay, when we talk about diesel, land or road diesel, or as the British and Commonwealth countries call it, automotive diesel oil, or ADO. We're talking about strictly transportation, higher quality road diesel that has minimal sulfur, minimal aromatics, and say in Europe and Asia, polyaromatics content, and higher cetane value. Cetane being a expression of the ignition value of a fuel under compression. This is solely land transport. In Asia and in the Middle East, not less so in Europe, tremendous amounts of general gas oil, which is our next definition. Other lower grade gas oil is used, particularly in Asia. Okay? North America we're defining as including Canada and Mexico, though many people in the US forget that. And Europe. Europe's a tricky one because the EU, at least until recently, was expanding every second year and adding countries that you had to remember where the capital was. Okay, we tried to use OECD countries that were also EU members. This excluded the two recent additions, Bulgaria and Romania, as well as the three Baltic countries and such energy world powers as Slovenia, Cyprus, and Malta. So I don't think materially they're going to really change things very much in this view. Middle East Gulf, we go from the top to the bottom, which is Iran, Iraq, Saudi, Bahrain, UAE, though it's a federation, not a country, Qatar, and we also include Yemen and Oman. Asia Pacific, think of as a great triangle from Pakistan to Japan to New Zealand. And in terms of this particular view, we're not counting the Russian Far East because Russian figures are not broken out or disaggregated by region. Okay, quickly, what we're running for are these 4 regions: North America, Europe, OECD, EU, Europe, Middle East Gulf, and Asia Pacific. We're comparing transport fuels, the shifting balances within and between the regions, competition between gasoline and road diesel, and I will say many times without thinking ADO, it's the same, and product imbalances by region as a price driver, as well as product quality, tax tariff impact, impact of biofuels and condensate, and a view of transport fuel surplus deficit. Just quickly, condensate is a natural gas liquid that's the equivalent of a light, low sulfur or sweet crude feedstock equivalent. It's just used like a light crude. Okay, the pecking order has changed a lot in the past 15, 20 years, and I found it rather amusing. I was in Italy in 2004 when the Unical bid was made by CNOOC, and I had all these people calling me up in this little village north of Rome, all of my clients saying, "Oh my God, the Chinese are buying up all the world's oil, and they use a lot of oil." Like, I say, yeah, where have you been for 15 years? It just kind of took this to really just focus people's mind and get them into a little panic. And of course, Chevron took good advantage of this and said, see, this is a strategic threat. Well, that's rubbish. But despite the Asian contagion of 1997-98, when we were staggered, okay, Asia Pacific already had overtaken Western Europe, and I'm using Western Europe not as the European Community of 1988, but the European Union of 15 countries. In 1988, this already occurred. By 1999, despite this incredible downturn, overtook all of Europe and the ex-Soviet Union, or CIS, by 1999. We believe that even if this recession is not terribly severe, and if growth rates bounce back quickly in 2009, 2010, Asia Pacific will overtake US and all of North America no later than 2010. And that's pretty conservative, some people would say earlier. There you see that graphically. So you see roughly every 10 years, Asia Pacific has surpassed another major oil region of the world. After North America, there's nothing left. Okay, transportation index is higher in Western markets. We run something very sophisticated for our part of the world, Asia Pacific and the Middle East Gulf, because people don't pay enough attention to the fact that there's a tremendous amount of non-transport use of dual capacity fuels, such as gas oil in Asia. Much of Asia Pacific road fuel is hidden in gas oil. And when you see these figures in the IEA, some of these people should be shot for their constant. This is ADO and gas oil separated, and now we're going to put them together again, okay? This happens consistently in IEA figures, and you can't understand whether the person doing it was completely conscious of their actions. Despite the dieselization of Europe, and Europe is rapidly dieselizing, in other words, they're shifting all of their land transport fuel growth into diesel. So it's not only that gasoline is dropping, but that all growth is occurring in diesel. Asia Pacific is also dieselizing, and people do not realize this. And we will overtake, Asia Pacific will overtake Europe no later than 2012. And again, something that Europeans are very, very unaware of. There remains substantial room for expansion of Asia Pacific ADO or road diesel use, particularly in China. There's our working of the percentage of gasoline versus diesel in land transport by these big regional units. Again, it's also indicative, we'll see in a later chart, that you'll see that transport, if we say transport fuels in the broader sense, including bunker, including jet fuel, aviation fuel, including minor uses of CNG and LPG, Asia has a lot of room for growth still. And as I was saying to Amy just before, we were looking at aviation fuel in Asia Pacific in our annual review of statistics. And you'll see that the Chinese will, even if you are very conservative, triple their aviation fuel use within 5 to 6 years. This is incredible. They're building 97 airports. 97. They have 3 airports capable of handling 30 million passengers right now. By 2011, they expect to have 9. So, a matter of fact, the numbers on China are always so strange that I go back to my old colleague from the East-West Center, David Fridley, who is, I think, one of the best on trying to weigh China and Chinese statistics and say, this is outrageous, is it true? Okay, there's a very different focus in different parts of the world on land transport fuels. North America, gasoline is dominant. In the US, nearly half of total oil use, more than 2/3 of road fuel use. OECD, EU is the mirror image, okay? It's the reverse. Diesel is dominant and becoming ever more dominant. But even in Europe, you'll see some very interesting things. Okay, Britain has won the unenviable prize of being the most expensive place to buy anything. Okay, and you can say that it's not only for petroleum products. Okay, but you can see very clearly that gasoline has tended to be favored by tax tariff policy in Northern Europe, and diesel has been favored in Southern Europe. It is now going that a place like Germany, which used to be heavily diesel, is now 52%, heavily gasoline is now 52% diesel. So there's a bit of a divide within the EU, but directionally they're all going the same way, diesel. Mideast, gasoline is dominant and growing in the proportion of road fuels. And there was a bit of a reverse of that a few years ago, but now that they need gas oil in general to make up for the lag in incremental natural gas supplies, power gen basically, they've decided basically to favor gasoline again, and it's been growing very rapidly the past 3 years. We'll be having a study out at mid-year on the future of Middle East product exports, and this is a very basic point. In Asia Pacific, road diesel dominates. Okay, China and Japan were the traditional exceptions. Now, if you look at this chart, okay, most of it's not a surprise, okay, gasoline versus ADUs, but take a look at that last one. If you take Japan and China out, you'll see how dominant ADO or diesel really is. And China, until relatively recently, made every effort on earth to restrain. They knew they couldn't suppress. They knew they couldn't roll back, but try to slow the rate of demand growth in general gas oil and in particular diesel. Matter of fact, it was only last year that the first car factory, Volkswagen, opened in Pudong near Shanghai, that produced private vehicles that had diesel engines. They were reserved for light trucks and trucks previously. That's the first factory in China. So there's signs that this policy is eroding or possibly going to be reversed. Okay, this is what I said, indicative, okay, rather than actual. As of last week, this is the way it looked, okay. Gasoline, you'll see that the demand is overwhelmingly North America gasoline, and you see how the US makes up most of that. Even if you just looked at the US alone, and remember, we're only looking at gasoline per se. We're not looking at gasoline components. One of the difficulties in this field of transport fuels is you could always take components to make more gasoline, okay? You can always blend gas oils to produce a diesel that meets the product quality specifications of a tighter or higher quality region. The difference that we made, distinction there, is we excluded components because you can't use a component directly into any car engine anywhere in the world and run a car. You can use a lower quality diesel in parts of the world if it's allowed. It's a finished product, okay? And that's the distinction we had there. If you threw in components, it's actually something like 1.4 million barrels a day deficit. It's incredible. It's very large. Just as much as if you take the, Alice through the looking glass, look at it from a European point of view. 600 is conservative because they take in some lower quality straight run gas oil, which has most of the traits they want in a diesel, and they may desulfurize it, they may blend it, they may add something. Okay, this is our estimate of what we believe the deficit was in 2006 for European diesel. Could be actually larger if you started picking out what's coming in as blend stock. Middle East is a bit clearer. Basically, if they didn't reform prices when times were bad, they're not going to do it when times are good. So, let the good times roll, the hell with it. You may not have much of a culture in general. You may have no place else to spend your money, but you have cheap gasoline. That's what happens in Iran. Okay? So that deficit basically occurred because when our current president came in Iran, he just lifted all the restrictions on NIOC, was attempting to try to, if not suppress, at least try to contain incremental gasoline growth. What's happened, what's evolved, is that despite putting in condensate splitters in a number of countries, and more are coming on this year, we do a lot of work in NGLs and condensate. And since condensate gives you more than half naphtha yield naturally, you could produce one hell of a lot of gasoline out of a very simple facility, so long as it's not very high quality. So even this 250 MBD is the deficit even with condensate splitters. If you had no condensate splitters, it would be more like 600 or 700, okay? So it's really rather remarkable that a part of the world that produces so much oil and that exports so much product is actually a net importer in a big way of gasoline. And you know where it's coming from? India, mainly India. You never thought the country that you'd think of as a basket case in petroleum products, they're going to be spewing it out over the next few years, and we're going to feel it here in the US too. ADO, basically straight run gas oil out of the Middle East, other than fairly high sulfur, has wonderful cetane, doesn't have to be cracked heavily, gives you good basic road diesel. Now, if you could blend it up, if you could desulfurize it, you could play with it, they're going to be producing net 350 MBD of moderately good quality ADO. They produce another 300,000 or 400,000 barrels on top of that of lousy general gas oil and marine diesel, and that goes basically east. Asia Pacific, well, one of the problems we have when we're trying to describe our home parish is that you have economies like China, which are so enormous and continental, and if you talk to the State Planning or Reform and Planning Commission, they don't know what's going on either. So, you shouldn't feel alone. It's rather amusing when you're talking to government officials in private and say, well, we know those figures are not right, but we don't have any better ones, And they're really pretty honest in private, at least. Down to something like Brunei, 11,000 barrels a day. Their little teapot basically supplies the country. Countries as sophisticated as Japan, which has ADO diesel specs that are even tighter than Europe, down to countries that basically, if it burns, it's used. Okay, there are not too many of those places left, but I'd probably put some of the minor markets like Laos, and even a major one that's still trying to get out of this mess they've gotten themselves into, like Pakistan. Basically, they're still slightly long on ADO, in part because the quality standards are still lower than Europe. In many ways, though, advanced OECD Asia is equal to, in some ways, ahead of US quality specifications. And that kind of is shocking to Americans, but we've dawdled too long. Okay, trade patterns. Basically, U.S. is a large finished gasoline net importer, nearly 1 million barrels. Imports are still rising, which is kind of interesting. I was just looking at the EIA data for the end of the last year in January. Still seems to be going up, even though demand's not that healthy. PAD 5, or the western part, PADD, came from the Second World War when they divided the country and U.S. territories into 5 districts. And it's basically the West Coast coastal states plus Nevada plus Arizona, a little bit of, was it a part of Wyoming, is it? And Alaska and Hawaii and the territories. It's semi-isolated both by the fact that California sets its own specs. It's the only country that can, the only state that can act like a country and set quality standards that are different than the other 49. And we had their senators both moaning and groaning 2 weeks ago that they don't have enough freedom to do this. So when I lived in Seattle 2 years ago, and my neighbors would complain about why is their gasoline 5 cents more than they just came back from New York or Houston or Atlanta, and I say, well, you're paying California's price. You know, there's 8 million people here in Washington, and there's 28 million in California. They're not going to make 2 sets of gasoline. Partially, it's also because of infrastructure. There are very, very few links, pipeline or even natural gas pipelines that go across. So it's kind of like this semi-independent country in terms of energy balance. And since California has gone ever further into the navel gazing, they've also cut themselves off from Asia Pacific as well. And the total, we've done a lot of work with Chevron on trans-Pacific trade, and even a sophisticated large company with great experience in this area still trying to find ways to get things going better. So it's basically the problem is that every time Asia is able to start to meet some of that West Coast demand, California changes again. Okay. The MTBE phase out further fragmented gasoline specifications across the country, and part of this struggle between federal and state governments on EPA and quality standards, etc. There is a legitimate concern of the federal government. First, they are supposed to be the sole arbiters of interstate trade. And secondly, if we have many, many different markets with many, many different specifications, it makes it harder and harder to meet localized imbalances, whether we're talking about gasoline or diesel. Europe and Venezuela are the main gasoline supply sources. India is emerging. Reliance is test running next week, or starts the test running of its second refinery at Jamnagar in Gujarat, in the western part of the country. And Chevron's the partner there. You will see huge, large, clean products tankers going all the way to Richmond, California, and all the way to Pascagoula, Mississippi. You will see Reliance exporting into Argentina, into Eastern Europe, into every nook and cranny of the world, because this is a USGC refinery transplanted to Asia. There is nothing that will be more sophisticated than this refinery. So watch for India. Okay. Basically, you have exports in 2 directions on gas oil. The higher quality ADO is going a bit to Europe, where obviously it gets the best price. General quality gas oil and the lower quality ADO is going to Latin America and to Africa, and occasionally to Asia, because we have tremendous general gas oil use as well as big bunker. While overall gas oil exports are strong, we remain a net importer in the U.S. of low sulfur gas oil and an exporter of high sulfur gas oil. And you can see this very clearly if you look at the EIA numbers. Wish the Mexicans would have numbers that good, but don't have it. Okay, Europe. Steady decline of gasoline demand since 2002. This is not just yesterday or the year before or that. This has been going on now 5-6 years. Part of it is fellows like the present Prime Minister of Britain, who has always found it convenient to tax oil products when he needs a few £100 million. I almost fell out of my chair 2 Decembers ago when I was in London, seeing then Chancellor Brown explain how he was going to save the earth by charging me £80 for my ticket to come to visit London. You'll see that part of it is this tax-driven. People just buy less simply because it is most heavily taxed. Part of it is just a determined shift to diesel, and that is basically partially through this tax tariff policy. In the end, and people forget this, you will be able to always produce a higher percentage yield of good quality diesel than you will be able to produce good quality gasoline. And essentially, and I'll go into this later, gasoline is blended. It's put together like Frankenstein's monster. It's assembled, while diesel is still manufactured, though you do use blending ever more. Okay. Nearly half of U.S. gasoline and component imports come from Europe. Tightening specs are making the finished ADO particularly difficult to import, and I'll go into the specs later. General gas oil, particularly from Russia, is imported as blend stock if it's straight run. In other words, it just comes straight from distillation. It's higher in sulfur, but they are putting in ever more desulfurization. Okay, has good cetane, has good cold properties, has good pour. Middle East ADO and gasoline, surprisingly, is tiny going to Europe. They basically have been shut out since about 2003. In 2006, it was less than 10 MBD each. Think of this. An area that exports huge amounts of product is exporting this little trickle to Europe. Now, even that Russian supply, they're having problems. They were having wingdings last month in January when they went to 0.1% sulfur general gas oil, and most of the Russian refiners weren't ready. So they said, oh, we only have 0.2, and they said, well, we have to get special dispensation to take it in as blend stock, blah, blah, blah. Big mess. Okay, this is what happens when you don't coordinate your regions. Mideast Gulf, net importer of gasoline, as I said. Export avails depend on Iran. Now, since this gentleman has taken over in the current regime in Iran, it's kind of like watching the Three Stooges School of Management. In the middle of last year, they put down rationing for gasoline. NIOC was told to stop importing, and they were able to cut gasoline imports by 100,000 barrels a day within 3 months. Okay, that's pretty good. Already they've increased the ration. They started to reverse policy. They're probably going to be back to where they started in 2009. That means Iran is going to constantly act as a magnet, not only for other intra-Gulf trade, but for the Indian trade. And not for Reliance, because Reliance can produce gasoline that can go anywhere, but all the new guys on the block, the Essars, the Hindustans, the Bharats, the new IOC facilities at Panipat, these are the guys who are going to push it right into Iran. Gas oil exports over 500, but the ADO, as you saw, 300 is much less, okay? That excluded bunker over 500. Bunker, it's another 150, 180. AP, Asia Pacific, takes most of the gasoline, gas oil, and ADO. Singapore is an enormous blending center and is getting bigger. And everyone's getting into it, the independents, the state companies, as well as the majors. They've just added something like a 40% expansion of blending capacity, tank storage in Singapore over the past 2 years, and it's pretty much filled up already. So, I mean, this gives you some idea of the scale. But quality constraints are beginning to handicap even Asia-Pacific sales. ADO mainly on sulfur, gasoline on aromatics, and benzene. Okay, these are primary specifications that make it a little bit more difficult. Demand growth has been prompted by price controls. Basically, even in the countries that have the most, quote, market-oriented prices, ANOC, Dubai in the UAE, Kuwait and Qatar, they're still well below world prices. They're not quite as ridiculous as the Iranian price, which after 25% increase, jumped up to 47 cents a gallon. Okay? But that's considerable. So you see gasoline up 24% over 3 years and ADO 19%. Asia Pacific, it's been chugging along, as I said before, talking to some people about Unocal. It's nothing new. It's just been going on for a long time. It's been increasingly focused in China. But we have to be real careful about Chinese statistics. I do a whole presentation on lies, damn lies, and Chinese statistics and show you all the tricks of the trade, okay? We try to do, and I'll show you an actual balance, a real balance, which I'm going to be pulling my hair out next month, spend a whole week just trying to make it work. But these IEA projections of apparent demand are not very accurate. China still increasingly leads half or more of Asia-Pacific incremental demand growth. Traditional buyer of Middle East product has been Asia-Pacific, usually 70–75%, excluding LPG. You throw in LPG, it's well over 80%. Despite the attention to gasoline, and this is really an important point, there is a dieselization of China, and it's been hidden in the gas oil figures, and not enough people have paid enough attention to this point. It was between 49.1 and 49.5% of what total gas oil use was true road diesel. Now again, it's not European quality road diesel, but it's not bad stuff, okay? And we're talking about a country that in that year used 2.55 million barrels a day of gas oil, which is more than many countries use of total oil. There's a huge range of product quality across these 36 odd major markets. There's a focus on improving ADO first over gasoline. Asia Pacific will compete with EU on bidding for top quality ADO. Now, we did a lot of work on Middle East refineries, prospective grassroots and revamps in the past 2 years. None of these grassroots are going to really make much of a difference before 2013. The one exception is the revamp of Rabigh. And we already had the Oman refinery come on. So basically it's incremental debottleneck and expansion. So when we talk about that high quality ADO, we're talking in big volumes. It's not going to happen for a few years. When it does happen, Europe will be very surprised that Asia will be bidding for some of that, at least. Certainly the price is not going to be very cheap. U.S. West Coast trade, as I said, PAD 5, is very minimal. Imports and export, this figure of 350 is total. Okay, that's everything, including bunkers. So it's really pretty minimal when you consider the size of the West Coast market and the size of Asia Pacific. Okay, differences between diesel and gasoline. These two are the basic road fuels everywhere. We have LPG, we have CNG, we have other uses. Basically, these two make up the overwhelming majority of road fuels used worldwide. As I said before, diesel is still manufactured, gasoline is assembled. Okay? Product quality will continue to improve for both. There's spec tightening pressure on both. Blending will increase for both fuels, but again, you put gasoline together, you manufacture diesel. Biodiesel, however, will have far more of an impact than ethanol. This is what drives me crazy when you read all of this stuff in the States and how many hundreds of billions we'd like to throw here and there. I don't know if any of you remember Senator Dirksen many years ago. He was the Senate Minority Leader, Republican. He spoke like LBJ. He was from Southern Illinois. He spoke in those deep Stenorian tones like this. And he had a wonderful phrase. He said, "A billion here and a billion there, and pretty soon you're talking real money." Okay? Well, we're throwing tens of billions here and there, and we don't seem to understand a very basic difference between ethanol and biodiesel. Ethanol is a component. It's a piece that you put in to substitute for MTBE, which was a piece that was put in to substitute for lead, TEL, to prevent engine knock. You're just doing a volumetric replacement with something that's actually slightly less efficient. Okay? However, what makes biodiesel sexy is it has a multiplier effect. The goal is how many barrels of general gas oil, crappy quality general gas oil, can you rescue and turn into high quality ADO. Again, the ratio changes very much so depending on what base material you're working out of the general gas oil pool. But we estimate anywhere between 3 and 5 barrels. So your premium is not on a one-to-one volume basis. You have a multiplier, and that makes it very different. And people should consider this when they're talking about biofuels. These diverging specifications, not only within the United States, okay, but also between the various regions of the world, make it harder to meet demand through finished product imports. We're seeing this with diesel in Europe, gasoline in the US, and in Asia because we have no centralized economic political authority that sets a basic standard. EPA does not set Mexican or Canadian standards, but they don't wander too far off. simply because they do a lot of business back and forth. Europe does not, the EU does not set fuel quality in Serbia. Well, that doesn't matter very much, but let's say Turkey, okay? Let's say the Ukraine, Belarus, okay? But they do try to follow European standards as best they can, or they lag them, but they're trying to follow that way because it's supposed to be an economic zone. Price controls and retail subsidies encourage breakneck demand growth. You see this very clearly in the Middle East this decade. You see it in parts of Asia Pacific still. Most of Asia Pacific is not a free market, and people forget this. And it's just, you know, it's like that phrase, keep it simple, stupid. Most of it is not. Simple as that. So government policies, retail subsidies, import substitution, some of the craziest things you could imagine. Okay. You could import gasoline components into Korea, but you can't import gasoline. You cannot export gasoline, but you can call it topped condensate and export it. There's all sorts of tricks that you can play. Traders do play this all the time. Government tax tariff policy can promote one fuel over another, but people always forget it comes at a cost. In Australia, they're promoting LPG very strongly right now. This is even under the old Conservative government. And it's eaten into gasoline growth. Gasoline, Australia earlier this decade was still growing Australian demand 2 or 3% every year, which is amazing for a continental but still a mature economy. And the economy that wasn't doing terribly well back early part of the decade. But this LPG, when they gave it tax tariff, they gave them tax breaks on their income tax, they reduced the tax at the pump, etc., conversions kits, boom. Green concerns, rather than making life easier for fuel suppliers, are going to create further supply obstacles. One of them is obviously, you have to have 5% this or 10% that, whether it's gasoline or diesel. The other thing is that it seems that people in Brussels are determined to cut their own throat very, very slowly. And with the number that you saw before, the EU will have great difficulty meeting its diesel demand and still trying to increase the quality of the diesel that's used. By telling potential suppliers, import sources for biodiesel, that you have to have sustainable, prove that it's sustainable biodiesel. Well, how high is up? Why is there air? These are questions you can never answer. So you just kind of wonder, how do you prove that it's sustainable, or shall we say any more sustainable than heavily subsidizing sugar beet production in Belgium so that you could produce artificial ethanol? You tell me. Renewable fuels will have some impact by 2010. Okay, you see this definitely in the US, somewhat in Europe, somewhat in Asia Pacific. But as an alternative or a, shall we say, large supplement to conventional fuels, we think it's much further out. My point before, refiners can always produce greater volumes of high-quality ADO than gasoline. My wife is foreign-born European. We were in Italy a few years ago. We rented a Volkswagen Passat station wagon, which is about as big a car as you could take into an Italian village and get out. Okay. She liked it, and we're both used to driving manuals, and she said, why don't we buy this in the States? I said, well, it's going to cost some kind of premium, $8,000, $10,000, but well, let's see. And I said, the one thing, I'll be damned if I'm going to pay 20 cents more a gallon because some dumbo in Washington doesn't realize that diesel engines have changed over the past 30 years, and it's going to charge me a supplement for using, quote, a dirty fuel that's actually cleaner than ever more reformulated gasoline. Okay. This is going to have to change in our part of the world, okay? Problem is all our refineries are so contorted trying to push out huge amounts of gasoline that it would take a hell of a lot of money to straighten them out. So it's a devil's alternative choice. One thing to think of for all petroleum, transportation is always the sector that's hardest to substitute for oil products. It's always transportation, okay? I love in Europe when they was talking about a green tax on jet fuel jets coming into Europe. Now that's about 2% of your carbon emissions, and road is something like 45%, and power gen is the other 55%, but let's concentrate on the 2%, okay? Get those rich foreigners to pay. Okay, the coming of dieselization. Looking at look at the high price era. Europe's already started to dieselize at an incredible rate. It gained 431 MBD of ADO in this period, 203 to 206. Lost 262 MBD of gasoline demand. So a shift, still increasing in diesel, even when things were looking kind of rocky in Europe in 203. Gasoline's share of land transport fuel in the US actually fell marginally. That surprised me, but it did. Okay, it's not a huge amount, it's less than 2%, but over 3 years. Middle East gasoline demand popping along at over 7%, and it's about 5.5% for true road diesel. Neither of which any seller of oil products would sneeze at, but 7 to 5.5, it's definitely a difference. Asia Pacific, again, despite the fact that we're using huge amounts of non-transport fuels, gasoline demand has been popping along at 2.4%, and ADO, which is by far the greater, at 3.9%. Just think of this. This is the second biggest oil user in the world. The lowest proportion of gas oil use in transport, in other words, true road diesel as a proportion of gas oil, is Asia Pacific. And that's why I keep on saying there's a lot of room for expansion, and it will happen. The China card, okay, now, as I said, an awful lot of rubbish is spoken about China, generally speaking, and paid for by your tax dollars at the IEA and etc. But one of the things that's really amazing is how this has kind of been off the screen for so many analysts, okay, that no one seems to talk about that Chinese gasoline demand growth was really pretty impressive. Not only these past, I'm using just 203 to 206, but go back to 2000. It's pretty impressive. At the same time, they were adding on petrochemical capacity left and right, okay? Chinese petrochemical capacity, ethylene cracking doubled to 7.7 million tons from 2000 to 2007. It's going to double again, or more than double, through 2015. Doubling every 7 to 8 years. So everyone was focused at the light end of the barrel and say, wow, you know, how could they keep up? And that's why when China overtook Japan in 2004 as the top gasoline user in Asia, everyone said, oh, yeah, you know, Chinese are using all our oil. I love that 2004. Everyone in the US was saying they're using our oil. Okay. But little notice, diesel demand grew even faster. More than 300,000 barrels a day. Okay. The Chinese rail system was overwhelmed in 2003, 2004. And the mess you have in China right now, which I was joking with a Singapore Chinese friend who got stuck in Shanghai airport for 2 days. I said, government should have just told everyone to take another two weeks off for Lunar New Year's and tell them to stay home if they ever got there. Okay? The bad weather just exacerbated the problem that infrastructure is overwhelmed, and particularly what's changed this road fuel use. The rail system was overwhelmed by the shift of coal transport to road diesel. Wherever there's maritime or riverine transport, obviously you bring coal that way first. But a huge amount of coal shifted from, remember, it's not only in absolute terms, but the coal use is growing still, okay? China's the only major economy where more than 3/4 of base energy supply is coal. And what happened? It shifted to the roads. The last of the old pre-Khrushchev gasoline trucks are finally falling apart. It's all diesel. So in 2007, we see that gasoline, in 2006, they were about 20 MBD in absolute volume terms of each other. We see diesel overtaking gasoline last year, but again, I don't want to say it definitely till I look through the numbers very carefully. ADO certainly will be half of all gas oil use as of last year. But again, I want to examine those numbers very carefully in the next few weeks. By 2008, ADO demand in China will be almost equal to France and Germany. Gasoline demand larger than France, Germany, and the UK. That's pretty impressive. This is our real demand. Okay, you could get copies of this. I'd be very happy to explain to anyone how we got there. We try to do each year a real demand balance, supply, demand, import, exports, and tell you the truth, this is where some of the gray comes from. You'll see the numbers are pretty awesome, okay? And again, everyone looked at that ADO together with the gas oil and saying, oh, well, they're using a lot of gas oil, so what? So what's new? Well, they didn't realize how much of that gas oil was transport. Okay, let's kind of go through some maybe even Twilight Zone bizarre what ifs. Back to that example of buying a Passat. What if Washington, in its infinite wisdom, decided to even out the tax tariff issues between gasoline and ADO? What if it became logical and made economic sense for refiners to go rebalance their refineries to produce good quality diesel? Sure as hell can do it based on the slates that they're taking into the U.S. Gulf, which is what, 45% of the country's input of heavy sours. Okay, a huge amount. We could produce a lot of good quality diesel. It'll take investment, but it takes clear direction from Washington as to what a long-term energy strategy is. And I always think about, I've attended so many things at the Baker Institute where we talk about energy policy, and I kept on thinking, really is an energy policy? Has there been one? Who? Republican or Democrat? Who did this? I never noticed. Okay. What if the EU restricts biodiesel imports, like they've been making rumbling noises about imports from Indonesia and Malaysia based on palm oil? What if they say, oh, we're determined to hang ourselves, so we won't take any biodiesel from these markets. They haven't proved it's sustainable. What if? Well, they'll be in a tight spot. They'll painted themselves into the corner. What if China fully and formally abandons these restrictions on ADO use and says, okay, we're going to reserve the top of the barrel for this gasoline petrochemical feedstock needs. Petrochemical feedstock's going to go very strong. What happens to the bottom? Whammo. You're going to see growth rates that are going to be pretty impressive. What if transport fuel prices in the Middle East Gulf and most of Asia Pacific rose to world levels? That's another one. Every time people, we have clients who say, oh, give us 10 years out, 15 years out. I say, well, sure, pick a number, any number. Are we assuming price controls? Are we assuming free market? When? How full is the price decontrol? How full is the sector reform? Blah, blah, blah. These are things you have to calculate. But I would assume that we would have continued growth, but at a slower rate. This is an example. It's not a perfect one. I didn't have time to redo it for end of 2007. But what prices are per liter and per gallon dollars, okay? Conversion rate is mid-206. You could get an idea why I say even places like Oman and, Qatar, okay, these places, it's still very cheap gasoline. And again, it's one of those perks, just like we Americans believe that we have the right to cheap gasoline. Isn't that in the Bill of Rights or is it in the Constitution? I'm not sure, but we believe very strongly in this idea. On the other hand, we're not going to overthrow the government if gasoline goes over $3 a gallon consistently. Okay. Quality issues, gasoline, primary specs, octane, sulfur, general aromatics, and then specifically benzene, which is the great no-no, and increasingly in more advanced markets, olefins levels. Each time you further restrict one of these things, sulfur, aromatics, benzene, or olefins, or increase your octane value, ignition value, you cut off some potential supply point within the refinery. You have to figure out where something goes and how do you use it. As I said, US and EU have regional standards, Middle East and Asia Pacific none. Increasing fragmentation still in the West. OECD Asia Pacific is very much catching up with the Atlantic Basin. I use the example that when I came to Singapore in '83, early '84, Shell was charging people for blending down gas oil to 1%. They just went over to 0.5. That's 25 years ago, but man, things have just changed. Asia is no longer the sump that everyone dumps their junk into. Okay. We have the aromatics benzene drawdown first. Olefin caps will limit the refiner options. MTBE phase out. This is something that's real American. Okay. No one really cares very much in Asia Pacific or the Middle East Gulf, though the Japanese have introduced ETBE, and there are limits on MTBE in many markets. Europeans have not been overly concerned. It takes a California panic to make national policy because they realize that if you have a tank leak, it'll pollute your water. Okay. We think that that's going to be delayed for many years. Are we going to have biofuel distortions again, differing standards. MTBE screws up our ability to import quickly if you have prompt needs for gasoline finished. Even if you can meet every other spec, often it's contaminated or even has traces of MTBE, it can't come in. Okay, leaded gasoline is still used in the Middle East, Gulf, and Asia Pacific. Most people don't realize that. Indonesia still uses a huge amount of this. And believe it or not, their program to improve gasoline quality is called Blue Skies, okay, which I thought that was kind of very NAA. High quality gasoline, okay, in the Middle East, say in terms of octane, can still be low quality in terms of aromatic benzene. So watch out when people use these relatives high and low, just like tall and short. It all depends who you're standing next to, okay? So be careful when people say high quality, low quality. We're seeing a rise in component trade in the Atlantic Basin because of all these factors, and a rise in export blending in both the Middle East, Gulf, and Asia Pacific. Okay. There's the basic gasoline specs, US, EU. We used Abu Dhabi. UAE has no unified specifications, has ANOC for Dubai and ADNOC for Abu Dhabi, and all the others, Emirates more or less fall between the two. And Japan, okay, and you see there's a lot of differences between all of them, okay? And this is what traders have to deal with when they're trying to arbitrage cargoes of finished product across the world. And that's why it's a lot easier. It's a lot harder than it looks, okay? You got to give them credit. They work for their money. Quality issues for diesel. Primary specs are sulfur, aromatics, PAH, or polyaromatics, which is what you get when you severely crack VGO. Cetane value, which is, remember, a diesel engine is compression, while a gasoline engine is explosion ignition, okay? PAH is generally the more restrictive one, and that's what's used in Europe and increasingly in Asia Pacific. Doesn't exist as a cap in the US or in the Middle East Gulf. Euro specs generally lead the world. So if you talk about 20 years ago, 10 years ago, Europe was the head. Asia Pacific was 3 steps behind Europe and 2 steps behind the US. Now we've pulled up more or less with the US, and we're only a step behind Europe. You see this particularly for diesel. Japanese ADO specs exceed the US, and in some ways are better than Euro specs, even with the new proposed quality standards for 210. What I like calling the triple witching hour is when refiners really have to put on their thinking caps. It's for Euro specs coming up. Drive your sulfur down to virtually nil, 100 ppm, then 50 ppm, then 10 ppm, which is virtually nil. Have a PAH cap going from 9 to 7 to 5 to 3. Then increasing your cetane. It doesn't matter whether you're saying number or index. One's the actual test, the other one's an estimate, but well over 50, okay? Japanese specs are already over 50 for cetane, just to give you an idea. Substantial volumes of lower quality gas oil are still needed in Asia Pacific, and I'll give you a figure. You'll see this in a chart. Much less so in Europe, though you still have a lot of general gas oil use in Eastern Europe, shall we say the new Europe or new EU. Sulfur, aromatics, pH removal are mechanical. Cetane depends on feedstock, and this goes back to biodiesel again. Biodiesel has one virtue that you can't mechanically reproduce. It gives one hell of a cetane boost in blending. Okay. Now it may cost you more, but cetane, as we get to ever more complicated formulations of gas oil, this is a value, and people don't realize it. And I've been really shocked at some very sophisticated companies not quite grasping this, that when we get into high cetane situations, as we're moving very rapidly, this is going to count for something. Okay. When you get above about 47 cetane additives, 47 index, 47 number, 48 index, they really don't count. EU is already short of high quality blend stock, and we sell a lot of that out of the US into Europe. Those are the specs. Again, you'll see that we in the US have a general aromatics, okay? While the rest of them have polyaromatics, okay? There is a polyaromatics limit in Qatar, but it's the only one of the Middle East countries that has a polyaromatics limit. Okay, basically because they're producing most of their diesel from condensate, a junky old refinery, and now they're producing synthetic GTL-based gas oil, which is cat's meow. Okay, look at these Japanese figures. Japanese ADO is set to go down to, polyaromatics, the ceiling's set to drop to 7 or 8. They haven't decided by 2009-10. They haven't decided on final date. It's still going to be ahead of the EU slightly. So meeting these things of sulfur, aromatics, polyaromatics, and cetane value is going to be the keys. Summary of incremental refining capacity. Again, this is a huge part. Most of the world, we can't go into everything. Going to have moderate volume additions, focus basic capacity, and gasoline. In Washington State, I lived near Anacortes, which was one of the last refineries built in the United States. And I used to show that to people and say, we're going to pay for this. Okay. Now we have big stuff coming up here, lots of plans in the Midwest. But it's like gas projects. If anything can go wrong, it will. So we're assuming not the full schedule that we're going to have 1 million barrels of new capacity by the end of 2010, but more like 600,000 at most by 2010. Do this same kind of very conservative look at refinery additions for all the regions. Europe, minimal volume base capacity. The focus is gas oil, ADO, desulfurization, and hydrocracking. Because hydrocracking is what you fall back to, baby, when you need lots of gas oil. Okay. You don't go to an FCC or an RCC. You go back to the hydrocracker. It costs a bomb in capital. It costs a lot in operating costs, but it's the only thing that's going to give you what you need. Middle East, as I said before, basically we're going to have little add-ons for this next 2-3 years, and it's post-2012, 2013, maybe even 2014 for a lot of these big grassroots refineries. One of the 2 foreign JVs, the rumor mill keeps on saying, is going to be canceled. Al Zawar, inshallah, will be up by 2013-14, not 2011-12. Okay, if they can make up their mind at the end of the month. New obstacles keep up for each new project, so we're attempting very much to try to be conservative. Asia Pacific, even though we have far higher slated completions by 1-10, we cut that in half on the projects that we know are in trouble. And again, we're redoing our numbers right now. This all refers to the chart I'll just show you. But it's very clear that Asia Pacific will make up most of the incremental refining capacity coming on through 2010, and that China and India will be the lion's share. Okay, more than 3/4 of the base incremental, and anywhere between 60 and 70% of almost every other major unit you could imagine. We did this for a client of ours. We went unit by unit and compared each one. And it's really amazing how much these 2 markets are going to make up. There you have based on base, distillation capacity only, which I know is not a very accurate figure, but it gives you some idea of the scale that Asia Pacific alone accounts for nearly 2/3. And then if you throw in the Middle East Gulf, you'll see that the Atlantic Basin's 20%. Okay, and we finally got off our backsides and putting 20% in, so we should be congratulated, but is it enough, fast enough? Okay, we're doing a lot of work on this particular area, so I'm going to try to keep it brief. Middle East Gulf export avails. The delaying in building those grassroots that I've mentioned, as well as units focusing on improving gasoline quality, will keep exports of finished gasoline to Europe and to the US to a minimum. We believe it'll be 30 MBD or less through 2010. Most of the gasoline will move to Europe, move to Asia Pacific, not Europe, not the US. Yet Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and the UAE will increase their sales of Refamit and other gasoline components, possibly to as much as 80 MBD by 2010. Regular basis, 80 MBD on average. It could be much higher than that at a particular peak. And this is supported by increased reforming capacity and the adding of new condensate splitting capacity, which by the end of this year, you're going to have 80 MBD debottleneck coming up in Abu Dhabi, the ANOC splitter coming back at full, a new Qatari 146, It's all going to add a lot of gasoline out there. Someone like the KPC, they make a very careful calculation. Should we sell more lesser quality gasoline? Should we sell lesser qualities of top quality gasoline? Should we sell refament? Should we sell other components? Just like any other commercial company, they just figure where can they get the maximum value. And while there are a number of high-octane gasoline grades in the Middle East, aromatics, particularly benzene and sulfur, exceed Atlantic Basin ceilings in general. Singapore upgrades Middle East Gulf gasoline exports in a big way, okay? Supplementing what they used to get out of China and Vietnam, a few other places. The startup of Grassroots will be post-210. It's most likely going to be 212, 213 or beyond. Iran is the key on gasoline exports. If they don't rein in the runaway demand, and it appears that their resolve is already weakening, we're back to square one, okay? They will absorb all export avails possible of not very good gasoline. Gas oil exports will steadily rise through 210. ADO exports will tend to outpace general gas oil, partially because of these condensate splitters, okay? Partially because of a lot more hydrotreating coming in Middle East, current Middle East operating refining, okay? Asia Pacific will still be the general destination for both. Europe will not get relief in the immediate future from the Middle East. And this is a growing number of exporters regularly could produce 0.05%, 500 ppm, including Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and the UAE. Yet 150, okay, remember that's where we're going, is only exported in a regular way by 21011 from Kuwait and Qatar in any kind of volume. And that's because Qatar has the GTL coming on as well as splitters, and Kuwait has hydrodesulfurization and hydrotreating coming on. You have also very tiny amounts coming out of Oman. But in any substantive way, the Middle East will not ride to the rescue of the EU in the next 3 years. And that's something I think that Brussels doesn't understand. We see the Eurospec region only increasing imports of ADO from the Middle East Gulf in a limited fashion in terms of finished, high-quality ADO. There you go, export avails, okay? From the Middle East Gulf, we feel very certain of these figures, as much as you can be certain of any forecast. Basically, the gasoline goes into surplus slowly. It depends on Iran and how much you're balancing, producing maximum volume versus maximum quality. We think they're going to go for junk, and they're going to push junk into Iran so that you'll see a pretty fast rise into surplus, but it's not going to be very good quality, and it'll tend to stay in Asia Pacific or in the Gulf itself. Gas oil, you'll see continued rise, as you see. Big amounts of general gas oil, but also a pretty slower but steady rise in ADO. And it's going to be generally good quality ADO because straight run Middle East crudes provide high cetane, pretty good quality diesel. Okay, biofuels again. I've touched on most of these points. How do you prove that's sustainable? I mean, you know, that's as slippery a concept as the national debt. You know, they're talking 10% transport obligatory by 2020. A number of technology companies and investors have claimed that they could produce cellulosic biodiesel. In other words, not using an oil, but organic vegetal matter, and break down the cellulose in it to produce a biodiesel within 3 years. So we'll just have to see. I think that, again, any kind of prediction of 3 years usually end up being 5 years or more. Ethanol, as I said, is a volumetric replacement, while biodiesel is a supply multiplier. We have to wait on this cellulosic gasoline and ADO at least 3 years. I'd say probably more like 5. And that's why I think that our national policy of U.S. target of 379 MBD of ethanol by 2022 is a massive and grandiose waste of money. Okay, $1 billion here and $1 billion there. Little attention was paid to biodiesel. And that would have been the place to start to think about too. Rest of the world, we believe ethanol will have minimal impact, very little in Europe. Their imports, and they don't have a 55% tariff wall, by the way, in the EU. Their imports were less than 15 MBD of Brazilian ethanol. Okay, very, very tiny. But biodiesel could change gas oil blending, and that's the key one to watch in the other two major consumption regions, Asia Pacific and Europe. Okay, our assumptions, and this is where I struggled because every day we get a new piece of news that you have to rejig your numbers. The IEA said that we're going to have 1.7 million barrels a day gain in 2008. The EIA, DOE, U.S. Department of Energy was 1.4. We're more conservative than both. 1.2 to 1.4 is where we're aiming more or less for the whole world. U.S. marginal gasoline demand growth, static to declining ADO. We think that since ADO tends to be trucks, commerce, and transport, we believe that the recession, which is already here, but people can't acknowledge it till it's 2 quarters later. It's like, did you ever read a ghost story where someone's dead, but they don't realize it yet? That's what this recession feels like. Okay, we're in the recession. I was talking about this on New Year's Eve. I said we're in the recession. We just haven't been able to prove it yet. So we think they're going to be hit. ADO is going to be hit hard and reverse this past few years' gains. Europe will have an accelerating decline in gasoline demand, particularly if greedy governments try to push taxes up further and claim it's for green reasons. And when I say modest decline in ADO, I mean in ADO demand growth. It'll continue to grow. It's just not going to grow as fast. That's where the money's going to go, into diesel. Middle East, full steam ahead. Nothing's going to change while oil prices are high. We think we'll have slowing gasoline growth. And it depends very much on China, because China has accounted for more than half, and in some years more than 2/3 of all incremental gasoline use in any one year across Asia Pacific. That's pretty impressive. Okay, and that's why people were so focused on gasoline in China that they missed the diesel. But we see more substantial ADO growth. Okay, as I say, caveat emptor, this is the way we're looking at the next 3 years. That's North America, and I assure you, I had to call up many old buddies and say, how the hell does the Mexican market work? I have not a clue, okay? Because we wanted to make sure that we showed North America rather than the US, where we feel pretty confident of our numbers. So you see basically the deficit will just come off slightly by 2008, mainly because demand is not going to grow as fast. It'll come off a bit more simply because we'll add on about 600 MBD by 2010. And you figure something where 65 to 70% of that will be gasoline. If you have moderate demand growth rates, even when things recover, you have still, by 2010, a pretty massive deficit of finished gasoline. Okay? Europe, the other, Alice through the looking glass. You have a continued growth in that deficit of ADO. Now, this didn't even take into account, because they've not finalized the new spec tightening they want by 2010, which was given by the European Commission as proposed and will be finalized by mid-year. That actually could grow higher. We were trying to be conservative, and we only added 150 over 2.5, 3 years. Could be over 800. Middle East Gulf, again, you see directionally, it goes pretty much the same way. It'll drop. The deficit will drop this year because all these splitters are going to come on. It'll creep back up again by 2010 because the Iranians are not going to rein in their gasoline demand. Simple as that. ADO demand will continue to grow, but more or less it's going to stay stagnant as they focus on gasoline. Okay, and there will be a slowdown. Prices will come off slightly. I just came back from Qatar, and I went to a hotel in a section where I remember that they were just building it last time I was there, and I only recognized where I was by where I was in relation to the port. Okay, where the ministry was and where the port was. And then I could tell roughly where I was in Doha. And the first time I heard of Doha in Rome in 1979, I had to look it up in one of those big gazetteers, and sitting in the Italian press club saying, where the hell? It's somewhere in the Gulf, And it was in the tiniest type they had. So, okay, conclusions. Direct impacts on the U.S. U.S. structurally dependent on gasoline imports. Dependence will grow. And I'm just talking about finished gasoline, and components are another part of it. Traditional gasoline sources are not enough. India will become a major source of supply for the U.S. within the next 5 years. Greater U.S. dependence on gasoline imports has a national security dimension. The added refining capacity planned by 2010 will not eliminate the need for imports, and the U.S. is partially isolated in transport fuels by dependence on gasoline and lagging quality standards. Longer-term implications for U.S. transport fuels policy: boutique product specifications must be standardized. California's right to mandate fuel quality continues. PAD 5 isolation. There should be some better coordination of OECD product quality changes through the IEA, if the IEA is to be worth anything, to spur product arbitrage. Reduce tariff walls to encourage biofuel imports, particularly ethanol for this country. Accelerate research into cellulosic biofuels. Even out the tax tariff disparity. Global transport fuels, the future of global transport fuels. Near-term demand growth in the Atlantic Basin will slow. Mideast and Asia Pacific, steady expansion, though Asia will slow its rate of increase. They'll grow, but just a bit more slowly. The key product that'll move between Mideast, Europe, and Asia Pacific will be gas oil, ADO. Europe will be structurally short of high-quality ADO. Refinery investment is too limited, and the Middle East will not make a difference through 2011. The EU is painting itself further into a corner by mandating 10% biofuels and then dictating sustainable biofuels. Quality will increasingly dictate price differentials between ADO and general gas oil, as well as various grades of true road diesel. Europe will likely outbid Asia Pacific for limited quality ADO through 2010, but Asia's continued economic growth will draw an ever larger proportion of the high quality East, just as you see this growing competition in aviation fuel. Thank you very much. Questions, if anyone's awake. Can we do it from left to right? Just 1 second, please.
Just a quick thought. How does the production in the Russia, Caspian, and Central Asia, that volume of crude and the subsequent production of refined products fit into these balances that you...
Well, you know, in the end, crude is just that. It's a base material. Unless you have the means of transformation, the means of manufacture, the proper refining to get the right quality product in the right market, you could have all the crude on earth. Look at 91. Yeah. I mean, it didn't matter. The Saudis, they were VL, ULCCs of AH. I was in Singapore with PIW at the time. We tracked them. Huge amount of crude was out there, but you couldn't make it into what you need. I would say that it helps the Europeans in the sense that they have an alternative mid-light set of crudes to the North African, because the North Africans tend to take them to the cleaners, Libyans or Algerians, on light sweet crude. But again, they don't need gasoline. Right. They need diesel. So it's kind of funny that Europe is getting to be like Asia is in having your ideal feedstock for an Asian refiner, even if you're a sophisticated one, is mid-heavy sweet. And when I say sweet, I mean Asian standard sweet. It's like tall and short, it's relative. Asian sweet is waxy sweet, 0.2, 0.3 max. We say sweet for Oman being 1.3, okay? It gives them more choice, but you'll notice that that BTC blend is coming east quite regularly, not only to India, where they're willing to pay that premium, but quite regularly to a number of buyers. So it gives them more choice, yes. It doesn't change the very fact that they still have to invest a hell of a lot more downstream if they're going to meet these goals that they're setting for.
Is it then the thinking that over the next 4 or 5 years, or whatever the time horizon is, that Russia will start to consume more and more of its own production, so that they'll be
right,
likely
but, okay, yes, but also even what they don't consume is not going to be Euro spec. Yeah, that's what we use as a slang phrase, Euro spec, for the whole set of it. And remember that what we call Euro spec, we're looking from an oil perspective. You don't know how many times I call Brussels and I'm trying to explain to them, okay, I don't really need the 25 regulations. What quality do you ask for this product? What are your min max? And then it's like trying to describe the dark side of the moon. So.
Thank you.
Please.
Could you comment a little more, expand your comments about ethanol not changing the volumetric requirements for gasoline, if I understood it?
No, that ethanol is a volumetric replacement.
Okay.
In other words, you're getting more volume, but it's basically being put into, your impacts are less than in gas oil, because gas oil allows you to upgrade into a transport fuel many barrels of general gas oil, okay, while whether it's 10 or 20 until we get to be like the Brazilians and start building cars that take 85% ethanol, it's not going to change dramatically the supply situation either in quality or volume. It'll take 10% out to replace 10%.
You mean the supply situation for the United States?
Right, okay.
I understand Petrobras has a joint venture with a Japanese company for exporting increasing amounts of ethanol to Japan.
Right, that's the ETBE that I was talking about.
Yeah, okay.
It's still,
okay, then I understand.
yeah, it's the Mitsui and,
Involved in it.
was it Mitsubishi was it? Or
Mitsui.
Mitsui, I know, there was one other one.
Mitsubishi's looking at it, I think.
Okay, Mitsui I know is committed, we work with them. But the thing is that, again, very fascinating little, you know how Japanese announcements are more important for what they don't say than what they do. Beginning of last fiscal year, February I think it was, METI came out with this wonderful announcement, and I actually called up Ken Koyama to say, hi, does the Japanese read like the English? Where they suggested to refiners that ultimately you can produce a lot more better quality ADO than gasoline. So you might consider in your future investment plans. And so I asked him, well, did you hear anything further? He said, no, right now it's a suggestion, but let's just see what comes next, okay? So I don't know. I just think that people miss this idea of a one-for-one. You replaced lead with MTBE and you're going to replace ethanol for the lead. But until you change basic car engines, as the Brazilians have, but on the other hand, the Brazilians are still producing Volkswagen Beetles, okay, which wouldn't go in this country, okay. Until you change that, what's your max going to be? 10, 15, 20% maybe? It's certainly not going to be 85%. It's not going to, you're not going to have 10 million barrels a day of ethanol use. And it's going to, how many planet Earths would you need to raise the grain to produce that ethanol under current conditions? It's a very wasteful way of doing things.
And also to think about the statistics, we're at something like 4.9% ethanol now. You have to get to something like 6.7 just to replace the MTBE.
Yeah, because it's not a one-for-one replacement.
We're not replacing any gasoline yet. We're just trying to catch up with the MTBE supply that was taken out of the gasoline market.
Now, when we
You're talking about the United States, yeah. I'm thinking about other areas.
Okay, but in Japan, it's kind of interesting too, because they said, well, Japan, if you actually look at the numbers, it's kind of like 62 or 63%, 37%. They're big diesel users. Okay, they're just bigger gasoline users. Okay, so it's not exactly, there's no country in Asia Pacific other than possibly you could use Australia, where you have the closest to an American 85-15 kind of break. That's about it. No other country is close. It's always a little of this. It's like naphtha. It's never fully paraffinic or fully N plus A. It's kind of always both.
Two questions. In Europe, when you take the sulfur out of diesel, you take the lubricity out. So you must have 5%
aromatics.
Do you see in Europe 5, 10, 15, 20% going biodiesel in the future? And then second, do you see much research in low temperature and low pressure refineries to have to get more fuel out of a barrel at a much lower cost?
Rather than going the way of ever more severe cracking okay. First one I'm pretty well aware of because we've done a lot of work on GTL, which in some ways has the same problem. That when they started putting GTL derived gas oil as a blend stock to upgrade general gas oil, Shell had this happen in Hong Kong. It busted all those buses seals like within 6 weeks. You know, they just blew apart. They just said, Christ, you know, what the hell's going on here? All the buses broke down. So it's kind of like comment that was made about a Roman empress that she had every virtue but goodness. It has every virtue. The gas oil derived from GTL and biodiesel is similar, but lubricity. You have additives though, okay? They can make a difference. There are definitely limits, okay? And I think that with this 10%, they won't be at the absolute limit, but they'll be approaching it in Europe, okay? I don't think they can go much further, even though they're talking about other. You can't believe the nonsense you read, okay? Sometimes that you read, you know, what the directive says, and then you call up Brussels and you say, what do you really mean here? And you question them. I had a Eurocrat tell me, well, I could understand because you're in America, but you'd understand if Washington said this. I said, no, I wouldn't understand if Washington said it either. I mean, you know, you're assuming too much. They don't make much sense either, okay? The second item, I don't know as much. I'm not an engineer. I am unaware of any concerted research to go the other way, lower pressure, lower heat. It seems that if you have to break down the chains ever further, you have to use a combination of the two, pressure and heat. Once you start using heat and pressure to crack the hell out of these chains, you produce aromatics and polyaromatics, which then restricts the amount of stuff that you could feed back into the ADO pool, because you have a ceiling. All quality specifications are cumulative, they're progressive, they are ultimately irreversible anywhere in the world, okay? And that's something to kind of think about. It's not going to get easier. But then you come to the point you say, what are people willing to pay for it? I've seen the evolution of East Asia in particular, but now all of Asia Pacific, that people would live with the crap because they saw it as a sign of success. But then starting late 80s, the NICs started following the OECD countries, and now you got the new near NICs, the Malaysias and the Thailands, and even the developing giants. Now look at the Chinese are doing their best to, you know, present their best face, assuming that we don't have a major political row this summer for the Olympic Games. I mean, you know what progress is? My first memory of Beijing in 1984 was winter coal dust cabbage. And I'm a pipe smoker, and I could taste the coal dust. So that's pretty awful. You know what progress is? Now you could taste the auto exhaust, but you don't see it. And winter in Beijing is usually pretty clear, more often pretty clear, and you could actually see across the city, but you know how polluted it is once you take a nice fast walk. You start feeling it on your lungs, okay? So I mean, progress, yeah, they got a lot to go, but they are conscious of it now. And 25 years ago, they would say, who cares? Please.
You're seeing quite a few companies investing in refineries in Africa. Have you had any look at that? And what are the opportunities and how will it develop?
Again, Africa is not all parish. We have looked at West Africa we're doing a lot of work on high TAN crude right now. We've been looking at a bunch of refinery proposals. It comes down to the same problem that you would have had in Asia before the past 20 years or so of sustained growth took off, is if you have price controls, you don't have economic growth. Why do it? Now, we had that Nigeria meeting, when was that? Beginning of last year? I went to these NNPC guys and I said, look, why don't you're trying to reduce and eliminate gas flaring, why don't you give some incentive to all these producing companies to put up a condensate splitter and guarantee them a minority of the product to take out and sell at free market prices, and you get 60% subsidized. Now, I worked on the Wari project 30 years ago almost. What a mess, okay? Now, did they ever call back? Did they ever send an email back? Sent a half a dozen. I said, the hell with them. Okay, I don't need this grief. I can get grief in my own area. Okay, but if you think that N+A condensate is the natural thing in Nigeria, it's a shame it's being wasted. Okay, I think the problems are structural and political rather than the ability of the area to pull itself together. East Africa is going to face the same thing soon too. You have Mozambique coming up with oil, Uganda coming up with oil, possibly Kenya coming up with oil, Sudan being a major oil producer already. You know, will they squander it? You know what people used to say in Malaysia, why we keep everything so secretive about statistics? Who wants to become the Nigeria of the East? Honestly, I was told that many years. Who wants to end up like this country? It's very sad, but it's true. I would say that there's better places to put your money down if you're going into downstream, unless you have substantial upstream interest and you have to, shall we say, ExxonMobil was not thrilled to put the money into that first Qatar splitter, and neither was Total, but they have too many other fish to fry to squabble about a few $100 million in a splitter project overrun, you know. Yeah, you got too many other interests in Qatar to worry about it. On the other hand, Gabon's another story.
Yeah.
Any other questions, please?
Do you think cold liquids will be produced at significant volumes?
I'm sorry?
Cold liquids at significant volumes in the US or China?
Coal liquids, CTL, right. The problem with coal liquids, I could see beyond general environmental worries about what do you do with the dirty water, what do you do with the ash, what do you do with a number of byproducts of the manufacturing, is you need a damn lot of water. 2 tons of water for every ton of coal just to clean it, pulverize it, get it to processing. Okay, you use more water, remember, when you're burning it to create the syngas, to create the artificial crude, than to hydrocrack the crude, okay? In China, the coal is where the people aren't, and the water is where neither are. So who do you bring to who? You bring the water to the coal, I imagine, because the coal would be much more expensive to bring to the water. There's clean water shortages already in many parts of North China. I don't know, maybe you could use recycled water, wastewater. I see, oddly enough, we just did for a Japanese client looking at CTL in Indonesia and India. They're just starting, but Indonesia's got huge quantities of good quality steam coal in Kalimantan. It's got easy access to marine freight. It's got water coming out of the Kazoo. Much of southern Kalimantan is 9-month monsoon, so it's pretty wet most of the year. My joke in Singapore was that we don't have a dry season, we have a wet season and a wetter one. So, I mean, there's a lot of Southeast Asia like that. India too, at least in the Northeast. If you can't take this not terribly good quality coal out and bring it all the way around, make something with it. You have a lot of water in the Northeast, that's not the problem, okay? So, the Chinese are most advanced, they're putting in huge amounts of money. Shenhua, the national coal company, has agreements with Sasol, Shell, and there's a third one I can't remember. But they are, if you look at their numbers on their website, they talk about, I don't know, 700,000 barrels a day by 2015. Right, I mean, this is going to occur next Tuesday, right? These numbers are just unreal. But are they far in advance of anyone else in Asia Pacific? Yes. Could we potentially do this in the US? Well, if you remember Powder River Basin 20, 30 years ago, a lot of the fallout from that we're still feeling. So I would think that non-economic reasons would tend to make that less probable. As they said in The Economist this week, a planner said that democracy is inefficient, talking about infrastructure.
In any case, water prices are probably
going to go up rather than down.
Water price, if under conditions of high demand for the coal to liquids, water pricing could become a huge problem. I mean, you could find yourself some very expensive water in this country.
Well, if we stop giving it away in the West,
well, there'd be none. I mean, it would be,
Yeah, it's already
you'd have to shut down Phoenix,
Oh, is that a loss? We'll tell everyone go home to Mexico.
No, I mean that like it's like water up in Alberta.
Right.
Yeah.
Help me out. You've provided tremendous amounts of detail, but could you just recap the key drivers that are driving gas oil in the marketplace?
Okay.
Is it price? Is it...
In Asia Pacific, it's been government policy. It's been social prejudice. Gasoline was seen as rich man's fuel in developing countries, while gas oil was a, quote, social good, parentheses around it in both senses, political and social. Yes, as I said, most places in Asia Pacific do not have free markets, so that you had cheap. It's so funny. You had countries like Indonesia that subsidized the cancerous growth of the gas oil in general, including the ADO, not realizing that it's become ever more ADO rather than general gas oil, claiming that it's helping the poor rice farmer in upland Java run his, his irrigation pumps.
So it's perceived as an agricultural subsidy.
Well, as a subsidy for the poor, just like this nonsense about LPG in India being a subsidy for the poor. The poor in India do not burn LPG, they burn cow dung. And it's one of the first things you smell in rural India. Once you smell it, you never forget it. Okay, it's like Nazionale cigarettes in Rome. I mean, you smell it once, you'll remember. I would say subsidies, tradition, the ability to produce more, better quality in the more sophisticated refining countries, ADO than gasoline. Tendency to have to take a mid-heavy barrel anyway, because the fuel oil use is still enormous in Asia Pacific. That was one of the things that really opened up my eyes to how energy economists could have a great theory that doesn't work in the market. They say, well, as you get a more mature economy, as the economy matures, you move out of into transport away from stationary and from the heavier products to the lighter in general. Well, the growth in Asia Pacific 1990 to 2000, even with the crash of 98, was so great that we went from 13.5 million barrels a day total to 18.8. Okay, or it was at 19.8 in 2000. I think it's 19.8. And despite the fact that fuel oil as a proportion of the demand barrel fell from like 22.8% to like 17%, in absolute volumes it grew over 500,000 barrels a day. So it didn't get eliminated, it just decreased as a proportion of the whole, but it's still enormous. Okay, so it's a heavy barrel they need. In Europe, they started to choke the goose too hard in Northern Europe with taxes.
Gasoline.
Right, okay, so that Northern European economies started to move the way of the Southern Europeans who always defended the right to subsidize their ADO, Italy and France in particular, Greece, another one. I think that they realized ultimately that's the way, as the barrel gets heavier, it's easier to produce gas oil over gasoline. Just to show you how things have changed so much, I lived in Italy till '83, and Italy was the most expensive gasoline country in Europe at that time. Okay, and benzina was like, it was like caviar. Okay, you really went to the little pump there, and with trepidation with your 10,000 lira note. Now Italy's number 4 or 5. Okay, Northern Europe overtaxed it. I would say that in America, just because we're convinced because of the experience of the early 70s, where we had a lot of very lax standards on vehicle inspection. See, the problem with the compression engine is it just gets out of kilter much faster. So if they gave it, if you said, we have to have a quick, guaranteed, state-run, no more than a half-hour inspection of your diesel engine every 6 months, you could keep them pretty much in tune. Okay. One of the problems is they get out of tune very quickly because it's pressure. It's compression constantly. I think that it's just dumbness on the part of our bureaucracy in DC not recognizing how things have changed. You can produce less total emissions, particulates, if you take the whole package. In many ways, you could argue that the new ultra-clean diesels that they're coming out with in Japan and they're proposing for Europe are actually a better deal when you look at the whole package. Okay, a lot of reasons. But again, our whole refining system is twisted into this, I love that lovely economics phrase, structural deformation. Okay, and it's all twisted by this perverse desire we have to have only gasoline engines. And if you evened it up, someone like me coming back from Europe with a European spouse, I would have been happy to pay a bit more capital cost just to run it, but I'd be damned if I'm going to pay 20 cents more a gallon because those dumbos can't recognize reality. Okay? I'm sure there are other people like me. Anything else I can answer? Anyway, thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much.